Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and whatever you identify as. We are here for our VOD Market Day. I kind of think every year things change so quickly, we should probably put like WTF at the end of it. It is quite extraordinary how much has changed in just this 12 months, and that follows another year of change. Before that, it's could be one of life's mysteries, like why do people drink Aperol Spritz, I was thinking this morning, or who is watching that Lord of the Rings thing? How boring can they make an episode of Lord of the Rings? You may be a fan, I don't know. But we are here at least to give a sense of direction. Venice is all about, I think this is where the ecosystem is being built. You know, this is where we're beginning to see the patterns that we're all going to be relying on in the future. I think what we are seeing is have seen over the last year is quite serious questions about how far this amazing production boom that's going on in a recession right now can last. And some of that is also about the independence of IP rights, you know, productions that are actually independent and the mechanisms they might have for getting onto platforms that can realistically become viable businesses that can work and can allow independent production to actually to actually reach diverse audiences. How do you build engagement? The last 3 days, Eurovod, which is the organization which represents independent VOD platforms, has been running really forward-looking workshops where we've looked at a whole load of different approaches, and we've started talking about things like fast channels, but what we really have been talking about is how you connect diverse content, independent content with diverse audiences. And there are a lot of clues there that are now taking place, and I think these sessions you're going to hear from a variety of perspectives how we are going to go about in the future allowing independent producers to reach audiences in the way they want with the kind of diverse content that we need in terms of European culture. So that's the kind of introduction to this session. It's going to be a very hectic, fast-moving session, and I hope I can keep up. So let me first of all hand over to the president of Eurovod, Marc Putman, who is I will, I think, give you an introduction to this session, but also to Eurovod and how he sees this kind of movements around us.
Okay, Michael, thank you. You're very speeding things process up today. Thank you so much for attending the fourth edition of the VOD Market Day here in Venice. Eurovod, the European Association of Independent VOD Platforms in Europe. I cannot repeat it enough because it is something different than the traditional streamers from the United States. It's my honor to be here today and to open the fourth edition. At this place, exactly 1 year ago, we stood at the front step of the fourth of the fifth rise of the COVID wave across Europe. At that time, I told you about the tremendous opportunities of digital exploitation as traditional cinemas were still closed or at least partially opened. A lot of stakeholders did expect that we would return to the business as usual, but that scenario didn't turn out. The unexpected stabilization of growth created by the current war, energy crisis, and that several groups in society did not return to the traditional cinemas. And due to the number of enormous films not being released, the theatrical windows, especially for European independent films, have become smaller than ever. I'm pleased to share with you today that our ideas of how we think that digital explanation can be a solution for this situation. Today, it's the final day of our annual VOD Market event. We had great presentations and reflections, as Michael said, on our business developments. We discussed about the next big thing in the market, the rise of advertised-based fast channels and the chances that YouTube gives us. And we shared the first results of the two new pillars of our association. The first initiative, our member TRIART from Sweden, created with other Eurovod members the joint network VOD Lab to support the circulation of European films, to acquire films, and to work on common marketing campaigns, promoting our libraries thematically, and release newly acquired titles together. We believe that this is an important step towards a higher discoverability of films. And secondly, the first release of the Unified Exchange Platform, the marketplace where VOD development platform developers can exchange their modules and reuse them by other platforms and create new services. This is a unique achievement realized by our technical partner MediaChoice in the Netherlands, and we think this shows a huge potential for developers. The opportunities digital exploitation offer are still not being optimized according to us. A significant part of European films, we estimate about 60%, do not circulate outside their national market. We encourage initiatives taken by the European Commission to keep investing in the circulation of films to find broader audiences and increase demand. For that reason, we have suggested this morning to the European Commission to reduce the thresholds for additional circulation of films by requesting that films supported by public and EU grants should become available for digital exploitation without MGs after a first and secondary sales window to the territories where the film is not being sold, to be offered on a revenue share basis. And in order to improve the discoverability of films, we encourage the expansion of the European databases for films like Lumiere, so that track and trace of films can be improved, both to professionals in our industry as for consumers to explore what the European film has to offer. We are also happy to support the Lux Award initiative by the European Parliament and the European Film Academy by creating thematical month of films at our platforms. And thirdly, we believe that the current ecosystem mainly focuses on the one output, namely the creation of a film, is not longer suitable. The output of the development process should be more tailored to the demands of the audiences. Therefore, we believe that creators in the development phase should focus on the format rather than only the output of the film itself. If at the development stage, the creation process, the outcome is more variable, and next to the film, an output can also be a mini-series and a short form of content, that we would welcome that. So my call to policymakers and film creators to open up the format to allow filmmakers to create more than just a film and give space for additional content so that the chances for the audience to get access on new ways will be improved. And, not unimportant, the return on public investment will increase and for that reason strengthen the European audiovisual industry. Coming to an end. I'm looking forward to the speakers today, as Marc already announced them, and to be informed about the latest updates and key topics in the European VOD sector. We have asked inspiration how the music sector adapts and copes with the changes in their world, and we are keen to discuss today the ongoing discussion about IP rights and the chances of co-production in our streaming world. Thank you, Production Bricks, for facilitating us, and thank you, Pascal, specifically, and Michael for being our host. Thank you.
Okay, so, first of all, round of applause, I think. A lot of very practical initiatives, and I think at a time when Marc is talking about these things, it is a time of considerable change where everything from public funding through to particularly the independence of rights and the ability to reach audiences with lots of problems around the backlog of content and so on is something which we are all having to deal with right now. So what we're going to do, I'll introduce the speakers as they come up, but the first session, I think, Guy Bisson of Ampere Analysis, he's a very regular speaker with us, one of the people who I think has the greatest insight in the way that the market is developing. He's going to come and start you with an overview of the development of the VOD market, with a particular emphasis, I think, also on that critical factor of audiences and what we can know about the way audiences are thinking and behaving. So we'll start with Guy, and I'll introduce everyone else as they come up. So, Guy.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Marc. Good morning, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be back here in Venice. As you've just heard, I'm going to give you an overview of some of those dramatic changes that we've seen in the streaming market in the last 12 to 18 months. Is there? Okay. Yeah. So if we could get the slides up. Great, thank you. So trends to watch as streaming enters what I'm calling the new normal. What a hated phrase that is, that we all had to come used to that phrase over the last few years of the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic has had a massive influence on the speed at which the market has changed and developed, but also in the way that audience engagement has changed and altered over the past 2 years or so. Michael hinted at this, but I would argue very strongly that the last 18 months has seen more change in the streaming market than at any other period in its, believe it or not, 15-year history since Netflix first started streaming. So what are those changes? Well, first of all, another understated word, headwinds. And of course, we're talking about economic headwinds, not just the war in Ukraine, but the world possibly likely heading into recession, the cost of living crisis globally, which is impacting what audiences are willing to spend money on, and of course, how they engage with streaming services. So economic headwinds ahead. If you're in the traditional TV sector, the outlook doesn't look particularly great. There will be effectively no growth in television advertising, in public TV, and very little growth in traditional pay TV revenue. Even the streaming market, which has been growing at a stellar rate throughout the pandemic, is looking at a slowdown in terms of growth, both of online video advertising, which we're going to talk quite a lot about as we go through the presentation, but also in terms of subscription revenue to streaming services. So a slowdown on the cards for the coming year or two in the streaming space as well. Of course, we're all aware that Netflix gave the market a bit of a shock when they lost a couple of million subscribers, and in their most recent quarter, when they had forecast -2, they celebrated only losing 1 million customers. Most of those actually in North America, where they had put the price up, and that of course speaks to those economic headwinds again. But actually, overall, outside of Netflix, outside of Amazon, the streaming market is still growing relatively strongly. Interestingly, if we look at where that growth has come from over the last few years, you can see Netflix and Amazon there on the bottom, relatively stable but not particularly dramatic growth. The orange chunk is the studio streamers, the US global players, and Apple and others. They have been taking almost half of the new subscriber growth over the last 2 to 3 years. But they also are beginning to slow. And interestingly, now it's what I'm calling the everybody else who is going to take the majority of new customers. So as those studio platforms mature, as Netflix and Amazon already mature, all of these smaller niche players are taking the lion's share now of new customers. Of course, the rate at which streaming can grow is partly dependent on how many services people are willing and able to take. We can see in the US that the stacking rate, the number of services people take, has been flat effectively for just over 1 year. In theory, then, if we use this deeply flawed analysis and say clearly Europe can get to the same rate as the US, there's still plenty of headroom for growth in terms of that European stack. The European stack is not as high yet as in the US, so the dotted line taking it to where it would need to get to match the US, another couple of services perhaps in Europe. But the reality is that because there's been a big change in the last year with free streaming, ad-supported services, the stack in Europe is already one service higher, effectively. So the average streaming household in Europe is watching each month at least one additional free streaming service on top of their subscription bundle. So ad-supported, free-to-air streaming is fundamentally shifting the market, not only in terms of where the audience is going, but in terms of the potential headroom for additional service growth within the household from the subscription space. And as we approach a market that is effectively saturated, so this is what Netflix has been experiencing in North America, a completely saturated streaming market. AVOD, free streaming, plays a pivotal role in the ongoing transition away from some of those traditional ways of watching television towards less traditional, on-demand streaming ways of engaging with television. And that is why we're seeing, and I'll talk about this in a second, an increasing focus on what we call hybrid business models, namely a mix of subscription and advertising. Fundamental to the entire market, and this is probably one of the most important changes in the entire industry, not just within the streaming or on-demand space, but the entire value chain from the cinema onwards, is content supply. So content supply has shifted fundamentally. There are many ways that you can illustrate it, but this is just looking at some of the major studios who have their own streaming service, their content supply, in this case to Netflix. And what it shows very clearly is that around the time they were gearing up to launch their own streaming services, of course, they started pulling their content off other streaming platforms. Not just Netflix, but many others. And that change is fundamental, and that change is permanent. So content being held back by the players who hitherto were the major suppliers to the entire value chain within the global market. So the other fundamental change is that global streaming in particular requires global rights access. And that has shifted the economics of production. So when you're not global, it's considerably more favorable, of course, to acquire content, or considerably cheaper at least. As soon as you need that content on a global basis, the economics shift in favor, or certainly towards, production being a better way to get that content. So that, plus the holdback from the major suppliers, means there is a content boom, a global content boom. We all know that that's been going on for several years, shows no signs of ending. It may show signs of slowing, but it certainly shows no signs of ending. Okay. And what does that boom look like? Well, this is terms of new commissions and development deals post-COVID. And what you can see is that there was a massive upswing as soon as we started to come out of the pandemic of scripted content that had been difficult to make during the lockdowns. You can also see, interestingly, that streaming on-demand commissioning players are pushing content through from development at a much faster rate. So much more of what gets put into development goes into production far quicker when the commissioning party is a streamer than when it's a traditional linear broadcaster. And that is because content refresh and newness is so fundamental in the streaming and on-demand space. So if a global content boom is ongoing, that needs material, and it needs source material, and it needs talent. And that talent is also in great short supply at the moment. And that's why we're seeing an elevation in the value of intellectual property, whether that intellectual property is a comic or a book or a movie that's already been made or a TV show. And we're seeing elevation in the value of creative and production talent, which I call a new studio system. But instead of tying up actors and actresses as they did in the heyday of Hollywood into 10 movie contracts, they're tying up producers and writers and creators, and that is the new on-demand streaming-led studio star system that has emerged as a result of this need for a continuous refresh of new stories and new content. The other big change in the last 18 months is that the on-demand market has moved from one of customer acquisition to one of customer retention, becoming more important. And that changes the type of content that you need or want or should use to keep customers happy. So we're seeing a big shift away from some of the experimentation we saw, particularly with blockbuster movies, that was enabled by lockdown and enabled by cinemas being shut across the globe, towards a different type of content that is a customer retention type of content, not a customer acquisition type of content. And there is a very strong relationship between the breadth of the offer on a platform and the churn rate. Now, churn obviously is the number of customers that you lose each month. And the broader the catalog, very generally, the lower the churn rate. That kind of makes sense. It's kind of obvious. If you have a lot of content, there's going to be something there that will keep someone in the household happy and continuing to subscribe and access the platform. But it's also about original production. And in the AVOD space, ad-supported, which is more nascent than SVOD, there's a very strong relationship between the amount of original content on the platform and the viewing or the usage of that platform. So more originals, more viewers. But it's also about perception. And as the studio streamers have come online, we're seeing different ways to leverage the perception of breadth and the perception of freshness and the perception of newness in the content space. And a lot of that is based around IP. So Disney is a classic example of having moved entirely away from the concept of a channel brand towards a franchise-driven navigation of content. So the interface for Disney Plus, right at the top, doesn't have old Disney Channel brands, but it does have the Disney franchise intellectual property brands, and that is the way that you navigate and access and see the freshness of content within the Disney Plus platform. Similarly, HBO does not prioritize the channel brands either. It prioritizes show brands. And that's another way to think about highlighting the breadth of the content offer and the fact that there is something there to engage, hopefully, everybody in the family. And then as you move down the screen on HBO Max, you get, again, to the original content, so back to intellectual property that is unique to that platform in the case of HBO. Another fundamental shift, and again reflective of the content that is increasingly getting made, is around viewer tastes. So we kind of talk about international and how the production market has shifted away from the US, not away from, of course, it's still the biggest production market, but increasingly is embracing international production. And we can see that in the commissioning activity of pretty much everybody. But it's also reflected in viewer tastes. So when we ask consumers what their view and opinion of non-domestic content and non-US content, so overseas, subtitled, international content, there's been a significant increase in the number of people who say that they're watching that content and engaging with it on a regular basis. Of course, it's partly chicken and egg. The content is increasingly available on streaming platforms, so thus is getting watched more. But in terms of consumers' engagement and tastes, they are now embracing and enjoying international, subtitled, non-English, non-US content on an increasingly regular basis. And again, if you look at how that's impacted commissioning across the big streamers, all of them are now heavily engaged in commissioning original non-US content. Bear in mind that Disney Plus has only been around 2.5 years, and it's already got 30% of its original commissioning base is non-domestic, non-US. Netflix, you can see there already at 2/3 for their first run original production. Interestingly, though, if we look at the European landscape and we think specifically about European content, the best movies, and by best is a measure that we have, it's what we call the Ampere critical rating that gives every title a score, 0 to 100, on how well it is received by consumers. You can see that the European local and niche streaming platforms are the ones where the best European movies reside. A couple of outliers there, Apple, but Apple has a tiny, tiny volume, so it's easier to be good when you only have 3 European movies in your catalogue. So we've talked a few times about AVOD and advertising and FAST, but it really is a fundamental change. It's probably 18 months ago when I was giving these sort of presentations, when I highlighted how the market was entirely driven by a subscription model. So whereas television obviously is a dual model of pay TV and advertising, streaming until about 2 years ago was entirely subscription. And that has all changed, completely changed. I haven't got the slide, but I've got a slide that shows the business models of all of the major streamers. Left side, hybrid, advertising and subscription. Right side, subscription only. There's only one player on the right side, and that is Apple. They are the last holdout of a pure subscription model. So the market among the major global players has fundamentally shifted to embrace hybrid models. And the economics of hybrid are quite interesting. And we're going to look at that in a second. Let's first of all look at why this shift may have occurred at this point in time. Well, first of all, online video advertising. And I think I just skipped the slide. Just let me go back. Yeah. Online video advertising passed television advertising in Western Europe, actually everywhere, but this is just Western Europe to illustrate, in 2020. So during the pandemic, there was obviously a bit of a dip in traditional TV advertising. Online video shot past in terms of value. So the market is now bigger, considerably bigger for online video advertising than traditional TV. Most of that, to be fair, is YouTube and Facebook. But in a growing proportion is long-form television equivalent advertising wrapped around high-quality professional TV and movies within the streaming space. And in the US, at least, AVOD viewing is now at a level that is extremely interesting for the major streaming platforms. So around a third of US households are regularly watching a free streaming on-demand platform. In Europe, you can see, it has yet to fully find its feet. So European Big Five markets, only around 2 to 3% of households are watching one of the global free streamers. But that doesn't mean they're not watching ad-supported streaming TV. Because what they're watching is the broadcaster streaming services, which are, of course, ad-supported. So we have a very different market between the US, where it's the studio platforms, and the big globals, the Tubis and the Voodoos and Amazon's Freevee, that are dominating that AVOD market. And then Europe, where the broadcasters still dominate this space. And the content offer of the AVOD platforms is fundamentally in a different space from that of the pay platforms. Firstly, those international players have taken a strategy of extremely large catalogues, so huge amount of breadth, something for everyone in those catalogues, but at the cost of quality. So they are generally lower quality, older content, but in very, very large volumes, and that has been their strategy to date. But as I said, hybrid is now the dominant business model among streamers, among global streamers at least. And let's think a little bit about the economics of hybrid and of streaming advertising. It changes a number of things. It changes the way that the viewer engages with the platform, especially in the US, because in the US, the ad load, the number of ads per hour on broadcast TV, frankly, is insane. Around 20 minutes in some cases per hour of advertising, whereas a streamer, a Freevee or similar, will have around 5 minutes. And you'll have seen that Netflix has said they're going to have 4 minutes, just to be different from everybody. But that is a very different experience for the viewer from network and broadcast TV in the US. And the reason they can do that is because the amount of money they can charge per 1,000 viewers for that advertising is considerably higher, around $30 per 1,000 views in the US. Not as high in Europe. Now that compares to less than $10 for US network TV. In Europe, we're seeing a very different development. The ad loads on streaming are much higher. The cost per 1,000 is higher than broadcast, but it's not as high as the US. So the economic balance is slightly different, and that is also impacting how European households are engaging with streaming, because they're getting more ads than the US streaming viewers on their AVOD platforms. So drilling down into Netflix, this is our model for their advertising. It's probably well understood that Hulu makes more money from a hybrid customer than they do from a premium subscription customer in the US. But does that pan out outside the US? Remember that fundamental difference in cost per 1,000, fundamental difference in ad loads. Well, we've modeled out Netflix value per customer effectively in every region of the world. And while in North America they'll only make, we think, slightly more than a premium subscription customer, in Western Europe they will make considerably more, and in Asia they will make considerably more. So the economics of ad-supported and hybrid streaming can in fact be very, very favorable because of the premium that streamers are able to charge for the delivery of a very targeted audience. So premium, in fact, that Netflix has now said, allegedly, that they're expecting $65 per 1,000 views in the US market. We will see. But the point is that the economics of ad-supported streaming are actually extremely favorable in Western Europe because of that combination of ad load and the amount that one can charge above the rate that is charged for broadcast television. And what that means is that Netflix income will be up around 10% in key regions over what it would have been had they not launched advertising. So rather than a backward step, we're talking about a move that is fundamental, that is being made by every major player, that will increase revenue by around 10%, we think. And that's the reason that hybrid and fast channels are such a hot topic right now, and why the market is moving fundamentally in that direction. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I will be happy to take any questions, either on what's in the presentation or what wasn't in the presentation. So feel free.
Does anyone have questions? I've certainly the one at the front here. Can you wait for the mic and introduce yourself too?
Hello, I'm from Bisson TV. For how long do you think this trend, AVOD and fast, is going to last?
Well, I think it's a fundamental shift, so it's here
Guy, can I just add another element to that as well, which is, does the advertising market, because when it lasts, is the advertising market also if the economic pressure goes down, is that also going to hit it as well? So the two questions together.
Yeah, I say to the first point, it's here to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere. Everyone is doing it, and they're not going to go back on that. To the economic question, that's really key as well and fundamental. Firstly, advertising is always hit immediately in an economic downturn, whereas subscription businesses tend to be a bit more resilient. Where we find ourselves now, however, is slightly different. Because in the old days, subscription businesses, you were effectively tied in, usually to a 12-month contract, and that has all gone out the window. So while I expect advertising to be hit in the impending economic downturn, I actually think we might see an opposite trend to what we would normally expect, and it will actually increase free streaming viewing rather than decrease it, and thus the streaming AVOD market will be slightly protected, which is the opposite of what we would say for traditional TV. Of course, I don't know for sure, but that is my gut feeling at the moment. So I think that it's here to stay, and it's protected somewhat by the economic downturn, or will not be impacted as much as we might expect by the economic downturn.
Okay.
I've got a related question. I'm Vince from Puzaz TV as well. Do you see an increase in the number of users that is willing to pay to get the ads removed?
No, interestingly. We also survey that question across 27 different countries, and increasingly there's a large number of people who are tolerant of ads. What you might not expect is that younger people tend to be more tolerant of advertising. It tends to be the older generation who say, I hate adverts. And because streaming still skews much younger, there's a lot of people on streaming platforms who are perfectly happy to have advertising. And that's another reason why the hybrid model is so important to the streamers at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, another question at the front.
Yes, hi, I'm Alexandra Lebret from the European Producers Club. As your projection for Netflix has taken into account in the growth of the AVOD market, that everyone is going to be going into that field, meaning that it's a market that is going to be shared between a lot of people. And so maybe the potential of growth is not that, the 10% that you are mentioning. And one of the questions I have.
So, sorry, was the question, did we think everyone on Netflix would take the ad tier, or did I mishear?
No, in the projection you have of the growth of the market on AVOD, have you taken into account that every player will go into that market, and not only Netflix? It will be, a market that will be shared between, Amazon, and the hybrid model is the one that is spreading now. So the growth will be maybe less than the figures you are expecting.
Yes, but that's already a known quantity. So Disney, yes, is launching its ad tier in a couple of months. HBO, all of the big players are already going down that road. Yes, they will share the market. Actually, the fundamental problem, if there's a problem, is the viewing change. So I took the slide out at the last minute because I thought I was going to run over. But basically, Netflix viewing has halved in the last 8 years per Netflix customer. And that's partly an effect of there being many more platforms to watch, and partly effect of saturation in the market. So the model does assume an increase in the value of advertising over time, which will be necessary to counteract some of that decline in viewing that we're seeing for Netflix and for others. So you're correct, the market is increasingly fragmented, but we believe that the adjustment in the rates of advertising will more than compensate for reduction in viewing.
We've got one in the row behind. Sorry, there's a hand up behind you, Marc.
Thank you so much for this presentation. What is it expected in terms of current paying viewers that might then shift to the ad tier platform, and how is it going to affect then the revenues coming from the paying subscribers?
Yeah, good question, and it varies depending on who you're talking about. So Disney has said we think a very large number, for example, will take our ad tier. But you'll have seen what they've done with pricing. They're putting the price up $3 and keeping what will be the ad tier at the current price of a subscription tier. So they're betting heavily on advertising and expecting a lot of people to shift. Netflix is very different. They've gone for that low ad rate. They're expecting absolute premium ad rates. And we think a much smaller number will shift. Just a few percent will shift onto the ad tier in the case of Netflix. So that's already factored into that model.
But Guy, just quickly, because I'm following, I think the question also implies original production, which is what a lot of people are here thinking about, is there's been this boom in original production. Is that switch from potentially in a recession from SVOD to AVOD, is that something that could have a serious impact on the amount of money in European, to be funding European original production?
No, because as the slide showed at the end, the model suggests they'll actually have more money, not less, by adopting an ad-supported model. It may shift the type of content that is getting commissioned to satisfy a slightly different audience, but that's happening anyway. We're seeing a move, not a move away, but an embracement of reality TV, for example, light entertainment, that just didn't get commissioned at all 2 years ago. So a market that was entirely driven by original drama and movies now embraces a broader breadth of content. And as the opportunity to access the platforms broadens through advertising, so will the audience and so will the commissioning patterns. But I don't think we'll see a fundamental drop, although Netflix have said they will reduce the rate of increase in spending on original content.
Okay, Marc.
I have a question about it. Since we are talking about European productions as well and about circulation of European product among the platforms, I was curious, you said, of course, there's a rise of European products being commissioned, but is it also what you see in the viewing ratings from the platforms that indeed the appetite for European productions is also really increasing among the different countries in the European markets.
Yeah. We don't have actual viewing of European content, but we do have that slide that I put up earlier showing interest in European or non-US at least content, and that is definitely growing very, very strongly among the streaming customer base.
Okay, we've got one last question, which is in the middle here.
Good morning, I'm Alex from WeShort. Do you think ads-supported platforms can give a different perception of the content to the user? I mean, they feel the content is less valuable, then it's worth to pay for it. And how you target the ads collecting data to the right users, because we already have to match their tastes with the contents, and then we have also to match their tastes with the ads. Otherwise, they will be there will be not a good feeling of watching the ads.
Yeah, I'm going to say I don't have the answer to that, but we've actually been asked that fairly recently by someone. How do you assess how advertising affects different types of content and the perception of different types of content, and how does it vice versa? How does placing an ad in a documentary differ from placing it in a horror movie, for example? So those are fundamental questions that need to be answered. I don't have the answer, I'm afraid. But it's something we're looking at.
We can discuss about it.
Yeah, that's a good way to end the. We're going to have to end this this session. There was one slide up there which you did probably need to just comment on quickly, which is it seemed to be suggesting that quality, that kind of festival standard, independent production stuff. Everyone else, that's the IP, the independent VOD platforms seem really essential for that kind of content rather than the giants.
Specifically, that was specifically movies of European origin, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just worth stressing that point. Okay, so Guy, just outline, I think what you're giving us, this idea of headwinds, I think is a very useful one, because it could be that we come back in a year and we find that you'll be having your first slide saying the last 12 months have been the biggest change in the history of the sector. It does seem like we have one clarity that seems to be coming through. There's an oversupply, perhaps, of content and an undersupply of platforms, of talent, of original ideas, and perhaps audience time is in there as well. But all of these factors with recession and war and so on thrown in, it does leave something where there is a kind of watch this space element to your report.
Definitely to a degree. I think because the market has fundamentally shifted, and I mean the entire market from the cinema onwards all the way down the value chain, we're entering unknown. Normally we have something to go on when we're forecasting. We know what happened in the last recession. We know what happened in the recession before that. But the market was completely different in every way. From the supply of content, to the releasing strategies in cinemas, to the windowing, to who the players are, to the business models. And so we really are in unknown territory this time around. And all we can do is wait and see how severe that recession is, and try to move quickly when that does hit.
Okay, great way to end. And I think you've captured a whole lot of points there that people are going to be talking about, so be prepared to be grabbed at lunchtime. Guy's only 24. It's just, this is what this sector does for you. It's just too much. So we're going to take a little sidestep here towards music. So Chris Cooke, who is a journalist and more than that, I think consultant and expert in terms of music rights, I think it's worth thinking about looking at another sector where some of the same underlying fundamental issues are there around rights and around independence, but music's always a few years further down the track. So Chris, give us some insights. Where's the microphone? There it is. Aha.
There we go. Is it still morning? Are we still morning or are we nearly afternoon?
Yeah, it is morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. If I click that, do we move on? Or does somebody need to change a presentation? I'll try pressing it again. Oh, yeah, I think, oh, there we go. There's my logo. Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for having me here today. Obviously, as somebody who writes about, talks about, and teaches about music rights and the music business, this is a very exciting event for me to be at because I don't usually get to hang out at film festivals and on this side of the entertainment business. So that's very exciting. Just let me quickly introduce myself. This is me. My name is chriscooke.com. It's my website. It's where you can check me out online if you so wish. And I am the founder and the managing director of this company called CMU. We're based in London, in the UK, and we exist to help people navigate and understand the music business. And we do that in a number of different ways. We write about the music industry through our media. We have a daily bulletin. We have a weekly podcast. We do lots of training about the music business, music rights, music licensing, streaming, etc., both through our own training program and for various partners. We do lots of research on trends in the business, in rights and in licensing and in marketing, etc. And we present at lots of events around the world. So that's what we do at CMU. And what I thought I'd do here today, I'm going to begin by giving you a very, very, very speedy overview as to why music rights in particular are so complicated. And there's two reasons I'm doing that. First of all, it is the complexities of music rights that have had a big impact on where the music streaming market is at today. And it also poses some interesting challenges for where the opportunities in streaming in music are heading in the next decade. So it's good to understand the complexities, to understand the market today and the market in the future. The other thing is, for those of you on the audiovisual, the film, the TV side, some of you probably interact with the music industry because there is music in the content you are producing or the content you are licensing onto your platforms. And I suspect any of you who have interacted with the music industry from the AV side have always found it very confusing, have always found it very frustrating. And so I'm going to explain in 5 easy steps why are music rights in particular so complicated. So are we ready for my 5-step guide to music rights? And then we can talk about the markets, the streaming market for music. So here we go. 5 reasons music rights are complicated. Number 1. Most of you are probably aware that when we talk about music rights, we're actually talking about 2 very distinct different kinds of copyright. So as far as copyright law is concerned, songs and recordings are 2 different things. So when a songwriter, a musician, a composer writes a song, they create a copyright, and when they go into the studio and they record a version of that song, they create another copyright. So we have what I call the song rights, sometimes called the publishing rights, sometimes referred to as the author rights, and that's the copyright in composition and lyrics. And then we have the copyright in recordings, what I call the recording rights, sometimes the master rights, and if we're coming at this from a French copyright law perspective, it is what we would refer to in the context of music as the neighboring rights. And so those are 2 distinct different sets of copyright. And because copyright law treats songs and recordings separately, so does the music industry. So if anybody wants to use music, whether they want to launch a streaming service or they have a user-generated content platform where people are uploading videos that contain music, or you are a film or TV streaming service and there is music in your films and TV programs, you immediately need to sort out 2 sets of rights. One set of rights with the song rights and another set of rights with the recording rights. 2 basically different businesses. The 3 biggest operators in song rights are Sony, Universal, and Warner, and the 3 biggest operators in recording rights are Sony, Universal, and Warner, but the 2 sides of the business don't talk to each other, except when they meet in court, because they occasionally sue each other. So we have 2 different sets of rights, 2 different industries. The next complication comes from the fact that the artists and songwriters who are creating this music work with business partners in order to manage and exploit their rights. So on the song side of the business, songwriters will be working with what we call music publishers, or possibly rights administrators, and of course, the always fun collecting societies. And so as a songwriter, you will engage a music publisher or rights administrator to manage your rights, and you will join 1 or more collecting societies. Meanwhile, on the recording side, we have the record labels, or quite a lot of artists now basically set up their own labels and hire what we call a music distributor to do the heavy lifting. And then there are a separate set of collecting societies on the recording side of the business as well. Here's an important point. Digital is increasingly a multi-territory business. Many digital services aspire to be global. And this has created a challenge because music rights have traditionally been very territorial. And indeed, artists and songwriters, when picking their business partners, may pick different business partners in each country where they operate. So it isn't necessarily the case that there's a single publisher, a single label that controls the rights worldwide. And even where an artist or songwriter does do a single deal, a global deal with a publisher or a label, the publisher or label may then have other partners elsewhere in the world who actually manage the rights, particularly on the song side, on the publishing side. And of course, collecting societies traditionally only issued licenses in their home markets and would then have deals with other societies around the world to license their rights in other markets. So, music rights is a very territorial business. Streaming is a very global business. That has been a challenge. These global services come along, seeking global licenses, and they don't exist. Quick point here when it comes to original commissions. When a film or TV producer commissions music, rights are created, song rights and recording rights. The commission needs to state who's going to own those rights. But it's very often the case that artists and songwriters who work for movie studios or TV companies are not in a position to assign the rights to the commissioning entity, however much money that commissioning entity is offering. Generally speaking, certainly in Europe, when you join a collecting society on the song side, you assign to that society certain rights in every piece of music you will ever compose, and there's nothing anybody can do about that. So if you commission a French writer to write music for your movie, SACEM, the French Collecting Society, controls the rights in that music, and there's nothing you can do about that. In the US, Netflix is trying to do something about that, and there have been various moves to divorce commissioned music from the complexities of the industry and pressuring artists and writers to allow the commissioning entity to take all of the rights associated with the music. That is very controversial, and if anybody wants to do that, just be aware that the entire artist and songwriter community of the world will come after you. So we still have this complexity around artists and writers having multiple business partners, different business partners in different markets, and often because of industry conventions, those business partners will control the rights even if a movie studio commissions them to make music. Okay, 2 of 5. Number 3. Copyrights can be co-owned, and when it comes to songs, music publishing rights, they frequently are. So, of course, copyright law is quite clear on this. If 3 people get together to write a piece of music, or indeed to write a script, or to create an illustration, if people collaborate, they co-own the rights that are created. But in music, and particularly music publishing, that is incredibly common. Songwriters constantly collaborate, and when they do, they share the copyright in the music that they create. And then every single one of those co-creators might then have a deal with a different music publisher. So when we're clearing rights through publishers, often we have to do several deals for a single song. Most pop songs these days have in excess of 10 writers. So that's 10 writers, 10 co-owners, 10 publishers that you need to do a deal with in order to utilize that music. Okay, number 4. Music rights are sometimes licensed through direct deals, negotiated usually by labels and publishers, and sometimes music rights are negotiated through the good old collective licensing system, through the collecting societies, SACEM and GAMA and PRS, etc. Now, when it's direct and when it's collective, it depends, okay? So generally speaking, when you're synchronizing music into movies or games or adverts, it's going to begin with direct deals. Sheet music will usually begin with direct deals, whereas when it's live music, or if music is played in this room, or in most countries, traditional TV broadcasts are generally licensed through the collective licensing system. But it does differ. For example, with streaming, audio streaming, for recordings, it's direct deals. For Anglo-American songs, usually direct deals. For all other songs, collective licensing. So the rules do differ as to when it is direct licensing and when it is collective licensing. So general rule, the record industry does direct deals more often. The publishing, the song side, uses collective licensing more often. But it does differ depending on which country you're in, and it also differs according to the specific repertoire that you are using. Collective licensing on one level is a really good thing. Generally speaking, collecting societies will offer you a blanket license. That means you have access to all music. You don't have to navigate all of that co-ownership. And generally speaking, that's a global blanket license because all the societies are joined up around the world, and it makes it simpler. Of course, the downside is that collecting societies are basically monopolies, usually legally sanctioned monopolies in the countries in which they operate. The degree to which that monopoly is regulated varies hugely from country to country. In the US, I would argue it is overregulated. In much of Europe, it is probably underregulated. So that can be a challenge when you are a licensee. And also, collective licensing was always designed to be territorial. And that didn't matter because the customers were territorial. TV broadcasters are territorial. Concert promoters are territorial. Streaming services are not. And so with global or multi-territory streaming services, the collecting societies have had to tackle, particularly on the song side, with moving into multi-territory licensing. And that has happened, but it has just made things even more complicated. Okay, are you ready for the last complication? We are building. Those of you who know anything about copyright law will probably know that as a copyright owner, this is true for film rights as much as music rights, you have control over your asset in a number of different ways. Okay, copyright is all about control. Copyright is a principle that allows you as creators or as creative businesses to control the outputs of your creativity. And you can control them in a number of different ways. So you have control over the reproduction of your content, the distribution, the rental, the adaptation, the performance, the communication, and also this thing we call the making available of the content, which is really important when we're talking about streaming. So that is true whatever copyright we're talking about. There are different elements of the copyright. But in the music industry, we have traditionally divided those elements up. And we talk about things like mechanical rights, which is to do with reproduction. And we talk about performing rights, which is to do with performance and communication. And crucially, who you get a license from will differ depending on which of these controls are being exploited. Certainly on the song side, on the publishing side. So if Anglo-American repertoire, publishers control mechanical rights, collecting societies control performing rights. Streaming exploits both. A stream is both a copy and a making available at the same time. So immediately we now need two licenses for the songs. One to cover mechanical rights, one to cover performing rights. Slightly different in the rest of Europe, but that's how it operates in the Anglo-American markets. So what that means is, even when a film producer or TV producer directly negotiates sync deals with music publishers in order to synchronize music into a TV program or a movie, whenever that TV program or movie airs on TV or is made available via a streaming service, that deal that the producer did with the music publisher does not include the making available element. Okay, so as a platform, you license in the movie producer licensed the synchronization of the music, you are not covered to stream that music because the making available element is controlled by a collecting society. And the film producer didn't do a deal with a collecting society, so you have to. So there's this network of rights that need to be covered, and who covers them varies from time to time. The last thing to throw in here, I can see you all looking very confused. You can have these slides, we'll distribute them somehow. The last complication is, in most countries, performers, so in the context of music, this is recording artists, have remuneration rights in law whenever their music is used in certain ways. And we refer to that as the performer's right to equitable remuneration. And this coexists with the right of the copyright owner. So for example, when a radio station plays a record, they need a license from the labels to cover the recording. They would get that through a collecting society. But they also need a license from the performers because the performers have their own remuneration right. And that would also come from a collecting society. To date, this hasn't really affected streaming, but the musicians of Europe are lobbying hard to get a remuneration right for streaming. In Belgium, they've got it. So this is all going to start applying to streaming in at least a handful of countries in the years ahead. So you were pleased to hear that those are my 5 reasons why music rights are complicated. There are song rights and recording rights. They're separate. Artists and songwriters work with multiple business partners, and sometimes different business partners in different territories. Song copyrights are frequently co-owned. Sometimes the music industry uses direct licensing, sometimes it uses collective licensing, and sometimes it's not entirely clear what they're doing. And finally, the different elements of the copyright, the different controls of the copyright are often licensed differently. So just because a producer did a deal for one bit of the copyright does not mean the platform is licensed to exploit another bit of the copyright. Now, this means that we have what I call the music rights matrix, which basically means whenever you're using music, you need to make sure that a license exists somewhere covering the reproduction element of what you're doing with the music and the making available element, because if you're streaming, it's both. So we need to make sure that all of those are covered. Who issues the license? Who gets the license? The answer to that question is, it depends. There may also be performer remuneration rights that need to be covered. And of course, remember on the song side, where it's direct licensing, there may well be co-ownership of rights, and so we need to negotiate multiple deals. So I said at the start, you need to know all of this. First of all, for those of you using music in your audio-visual content, you need to know all of this. This is how music supervisors earn their keep. But also, this has had an impact on the way the music streaming business has developed. Because whenever we're using music, whether we're using it, synchronizing it into video, or we're using it on a digital service, we need to know what rights are exploited, who controls those rights, and who licenses those rights. And the answers to those questions are often quite complicated, particularly on the publishing side, on the song side. Yeah, we're nearly there. And of course, as I've already alluded to, who you do the deal with will depend on the controls that are being exploited, how you're using the music, and what country you're in. And if you're in multiple countries, it may be that the way you license the rights are different depending on the market. So, as it says on this slide, what has happened over the last 15 years is every time a new digital service comes to market, that service has to go to the industry and say, okay, we need a deal. And the industry says, okay, let's think about how you're using the music. What rights are you exploiting? What controls are you exploiting? In what way are you exploiting the rights? Who controls those rights? Is it label? Is it publisher? Is it a collecting society? Who controls the rights in each market? And then we have to come up with a list of, okay, these are all the people you're going to need to get licenses from. And very quickly, as a service, particularly if you want a big catalog of music, we're talking about 170, 180 deals that need to be done in order to come to market. This is why in music, we have the big mainstream streaming services: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, and then slightly lesser extent, Deezer, Tidal, etc. There are no real independent music streaming services. There are no niche streaming services. There are no real streaming services for jazz fans or classical fans. There's a couple that have had a go, but the problem is, for small independents, navigating all of that licensing is unrealistic. So it has stopped those more niche services from coming to market, which obviously is bad news for the artists and labels and writers who are making that music and have to compete within all of the other music that sits within a Spotify-type platform. So that's had a big impact on where we currently are. Moving forward, it's interesting hearing the previous presentation. I think in music streaming, the opportunity of the next 10 years is not a big shift into ad-funded, because music's had ad-funded from the start. And the music industry still sees ad-funded Spotify as an upsell platform. We don't make much money out of it, because Spotify is an audio service, and the advertising industry, whenever you talk about audio, think radio, and radio advertising was always cheap. So Spotify has struggled to get premium advertising rates. And therefore, free is an upsell platform to sell premium. The opportunity in music now and in the next 10 years is complementary services. It is YouTube, it is TikTok, it is Instagram, it is music in podcasts, it is music in fitness apps, it is music in games, and it is NFTs and the metaverse. Those are services that do not compete with Spotify. They are alternative uses of music. And we're starting to see those services bringing in significant revenues for the music industry. But the challenge is All of those services need to navigate everything I've just been through. And the last thing I would say, the last point on this slide, actually the music industry's biggest challenge today is that there is no central database of music rights. There is no central database that will tell you, for this recording, this song, these are the rights, these are who own them, these are who you need a deal from. That has been a problem for 20 years, but it's becoming an ever bigger problem because these opportunities in the TikTok universe, in the metaverse, in podcasts, are hindered by the lack of data. So that is why music rights are complicated. That's the impact it has had on the streaming market so far. And we are now at a point where there are some challenges in the music industry around those complexities and around rights data to truly unlock the next round of opportunities, which, as I say, in music are complementary services that use music in a way that does not compete with Spotify. And I will wrap it up there.
Thank you. Chris, well, first of all, I'm afraid we're going to have to shift the thing on. So if you do have questions, Chris is going to be here at over the lunchtime. I think what you do here is get a sense of the complexity, and particularly where we're looking at retaining and keeping independent rights for producers. This market is not going to get any less complicated, I think, is the one of the messages that's very clearly coming across. And I think there were a number of things, particularly around data at the end, that I thought would resonate with a number of you. I'm really sorry, because we're really pushing through here. But we've got Wendy Bernfeld, who I think can bring through a little bit of those first two sessions, joining us from the Netherlands. You'll probably have been aware of Wendy. The Right Stuff is one of those kind of key consultancies, I think, as far as digital rights is concerned. And she's certainly an expert on what we now call everyone else in Guy's session, but I think she'll give us a broader context. So, Wendy, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
The video's on. There we go. Okay, thanks everybody. Well, pivoting, I guess, back to Guy's speech, I wanted to pick up a couple of angles that might affect our whole debates around IP rights and value from a business point of view, business to business. So before I get into the other types, the subscription VODs that are not Netflix, Amazon, and the big five, I just wanted to pick up a few interesting changes in the past few months that are, I think, relevant and will impact both business and legal issues. The first thing you've obviously or hopefully seen is the sudden re-interest in theatrical distribution by certain streamers, although they, Warner has bounced around with having a premium VOD or not, going straight to digital or not. But recently, some of the streamers, including Netflix, have hired theatrical distribution people to start focusing on distribution. They've also started licensing their own originals to third-party competitors, like what happened when Netflix licensed Narcos to other so-called competing SVOD services. So you're starting to see evaluation and rights in different, you could call them windows. They've added these other angles like gaming, interactivity, VR, as you've seen, for example, with Netflix, but and of course the AdVOD or FAST sector that was discussed by Guy. I thought it would be interesting to point out, though, that some of the AdVOD is going to be tiers, like described, for example, Netflix perhaps offering it at $8 a month instead of 15 for a tier with ads. But other AdVOD's been around since the 90s, like YouTube, where it's just different content, usually library content, available on an ad-supported basis, almost like free TV after pay TV. So from the rights holders in the room, the creators, the producers, the distributors, the sales agents, but also the VOD platforms, at the moment, it's still true that films that are, say, 2 to 8 years old tend to fall within the sweet spot of an SVOD buyer, particularly the non-exclusive, non-premium ones. And films or TV shows 8 years plus tend to fall into the AdVOD. So it's not so much one replacing the other, but just having a succession of windows, almost like in the old days of theatrical, followed by DVD, followed by pay TV, followed by free TV. And there's still a fair amount of that going on right now as we speak, particularly since COVID, a huge interest in picking up library, older titles, whether for AdVOD or for SVOD services. So I think we shouldn't only look at the new original production, but actually the discoverability and licensing and relicensing and monetizing content you've already done 2 or 3 Venices ago that might be sitting on a shelf and might find a buyer somewhere else. We'll get into that in a minute, but I also wanted to draw to the attention you've seen among the big 5 types, huge cuts, for example, in HBO Max, HBO Europe, around staffing in originals and huge cuts on original production, except there'll be some preservation in France and Spain for that particular platform. But, you know, it's been really a bit of a bloodbath between July and August. And that's because of Warner Brothers Discovery new tiers coming out next year and delays in European localization. So it's consistent for the larger platforms to first begin with licensing what they already have in their shelves before they're producing new. And I think there's been, you know, that has caused people to focus more on acquisition, which is another way of exploiting your IP rights. You know, going back to see whether they can be sold either to the big 5 and or to the middle and smaller platforms. So those are some examples worth mentioning in trends. In the same breath, new platforms are about to launch, also from big players. I mean, we've followed Sky, UK, Germany, and Italy, but rolling out later this year and into next year, Sky Showtime, which is this mega combination of the Viacom and Universal groups, Peacock, all the Sky type stakeholders going back under the Comcast umbrella. But they're rolling out into Europe, into the 20 or 22 regions that are not UK, Germany, or Italy, which means after the inevitable beginning of mainly stakeholder content that they already own in their massive libraries, they will have to localize, both by buying stuff from these regions, Croatia, Romania, Benelux, you know, France. There will be a focus on buying, but also original production. So I think the next 2 years, even with the big players, will be a very interesting ballet. Currently, their Sky Showtime is planned to be premium SVOD, but it may well also bring out an AdVOD or a fast tier. So now if we switch to who else is out there, who are these other buyers I'd call them for distinction, not for quality, tier 2 and tier 3. If we call the tier 1 the big global streamers, the big 5 or 8, then every region has its own competitor, a telecom, a cable operator, or a broadcaster, a pay TV network, who has an SVOD of their own. And they are still predominantly mainstreamers, but they're not global, but they can be multi-region. So perfect example would be obviously Canal Plus and its recent developments, including the merger with SPII, which was a group of smaller SVOD thematic channels. Studio Canal, multiple regions, including Africa. You have Orange, or Orange Cinema series, which is also in talks with Canal Plus about perhaps combining forces. We have RTL Plus, or its SVOD, for example, in Holland, Videoland. Join in Germany. Salto, as you know, in France, the combination of M6, TF1, and France Télévisions. Viaplay is an interesting one because it's both a mainstreamer and a niche, depending which country you're in. If you are in the US right now watching Viaplay, it is more like a BritBox, best of the Nordics. In other words, you can't sell German content there. It'll be the Nordic content viewed for, say, €5 a month or dollars a month in America. But if you're here in Europe, Viaplay is a head-on mainstream competitor in multiple regions, not just the Nordics and Baltics and Poland and Benelux, but soon rolling into other regions, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the UK, and next year, Canada. So sometimes you'll have a platform that has a different character depending on the country it's in. And your role as a seller or producer is to fit into the programming in that region of the platform while balancing it against the other buying or producing opportunities. We've got Shahid in the Middle East, Stan in Australia, Bell's Crave. These are all mainstream head-on competitors who buy with proper flat license fees, and they produce originals. If you move to the next layer, who I'll call for the moment tier 3, they might be global, or they might just be in some regions, but they are cheaper and smaller, stackable add-ons, so a consumer can have Disney, Netflix, and Amazon, but also have Shudder for horror, or Hopster for kids, Marc TV for performing arts, or QWest for music. These are complementary niche services. They are all buying, and some of them are also funding. Now, admittedly, they don't fund to the volume and scale of the big five, but the opportunities are quite wide in just indies and art house and feature film. Obviously, Film in Spain and Portugal, Movie.com, Universenes Sooner in Benelux, Germany, Austria, Switzerland. You've got various American services that buy from Europe, such as IndieFlix and Fandor, and Australians like Rialto will buy indie and art house foreign language, what they call foreign language movies for Australia and New Zealand. So instead of doing one deal, if you don't have your big 5 deal with the big player for global, you can make 12 deals, non-exclusive, in the SVOD window, and then follow it up after with AdVOD as the title ages. On the documentary space, I mean, Docubay in India, DA Film here in Europe, Guide Doc in Spain, DocPlay in Australia. Curiosity Stream is an interesting one. You could call it the Netflix of docs. It straddles all the models, almost like an Amazon. It's an SVOD in hundreds of countries, but also has studios for production, linear television, and now a fast channel when it's not in SVOD. So again, a documentary producer or seller can make several deals depending on if the programming matches the feel and style of the platform. You can make multiple deals to those types of platforms. And for smaller niches, you know, even if we talk about GLBTQ+, and we have OUTtv, of course, here in the room, but there's also 5 or 7 other competitors around the world who will buy non-exclusively the same programming for flat fees. And some of them will fund, others will only buy. But all of this is a way to expand revenue and audience for your title. not to mention the expat-focused or diaspora-focused services like BritBox or ITVX, Best of British and its competitor Acorn, but also Afroland in America, Trace TV, Showmax. France Channel, of course, has taken French programming and brought it to America. So these sorts of sales and eventually commissions are available. And just fitting in your film, almost like online dating, fitting in, where is my match? You know, is it a documentary on Polish architecture during the war? Is it a zombie film? Who will buy it? You can go direct in many cases or through your sales rep to these platforms and make multiple small deals in the windows and still be able to license to AdVOD after or fast channels after. There are exceptions. Some of the fast channels players, the studio-owned ones like Pluto, Paramount, they will only want exclusive deals, but others are mainly non-exclusive. So it all turns on the rights. I'm just checking my time.
That's good, Wendy. We're kind of running, because this kind of leads us into the debate we're about to have. This seems like I'd say exactly what you're saying. There are the big players, and then there's that everyone else is quite fragmented. And how you put together deals across them all seems like a complicated task at this stage that maybe gets easier as they merge and as systems kind of become more regular. So I think that's probably, I think you've given a really strong outline of the overall state of the market. Has anyone got any specific questions? Because I think this is a really useful way to get into the debate we're about to have. As ever, Wendy, you've been interesting enough for us to be having lots of discussion. But I think that how you navigate the fragmented market feels to me like something we want to discuss on the next panel, if that's okay. Does anyone have any specifics for Wendy? Okay. In that case, Wendy, thanks for doing that. I think you've given a really interesting overview. And then let's have a round of applause for Wendy.
Thanks. Wish I was there.
And then if I can bring up the panel, we've got Mattias from TRIART. We've got Alexandra, from the European Producers Club. And we have Virada from FilmDo and indeed from Eurovod. So if you want to come up. Okay, we're going to get straight into this then with Alexandra. This is your kind of field, this stuff here. So, what we're really interested in all of this is we want to see great independent European films made by independent producers who keep their rights in a system that works. But what I've been hearing today feels like what you've been dealing with a lot. Very big players at the top, who are probably going to increasingly be demanding their pound of flesh in terms of global rights, and then a very fragmented market that still feels like it's in the process of being created. So how do, from your point of view, your members, how are producers trying to navigate, and what needs to be done?
To protect the IP. I think what is key in the presentation we have seen is the value of the IP, and it's going to increase in the future on AVOD, which is a non-exclusive, and even on the streamer sides. I had a discussion a few weeks ago with a streamer, and they told me that they didn't release the content in every country, and I remember a figure that the European Observatory used to give of a film on average was presented into global platforms only in 7 countries in Europe. between the 22 countries. So there is a use that is not done about the IP, and we can see that this content can be successful. This local content that I'm representing, I'm running an organization called the European Producers Club that gather 170 producers coming from 32 countries in Europe. The films and TV series they're producing are can be successful in certain countries, but not all of them. And that's why we should keep the rights and think a little bit differently the business model. Of course, the streamers have gone with a lot of money and a lot of ambitions, and you know, they really help to increase our market. With 3%, they discover with us that shows can be shown in local languages and be successful even in the US. And so they started to have that local production policy that we benefit from, and that was absolutely fantastic. What we discover as well, and that was one of the slides that was presented this morning, is the value of the IP. It was not that clear in the feature film business before, but here it's really important. I remember a leak from Netflix estimating the value of Squid Games at 900 millions. So it's a huge process, and we need to be more imaginative in the way we finance the works, and we are super happy to come to see local platforms expanding in Europe, such as Viaplay. But what I can see also, and maybe I'll stop after because you know I can speak forever, is the fact that when we were in the feature film industry, the person who were touching the audience, you know, making the link between the content and the audience, were financing through MG, whereas now everyone wants a share of the IP. So it's also a change in the business model for the producers, because they are the one taking the risks. So there maybe also needs some adjustment there. So a lot, you know, of thoughts. I have 2 pages if you want, so I can.
No, I'm going to call you back in so you can jump in. But the points that you're making, I think, are one which is not. I don't think it's always understood or stated enough, which is there is enormous value in IP, and that actually producers are creating that enormous value. It's just that enormous value is not necessarily, you don't necessarily have a public funding or a financing model or even a distribution model necessarily that you feel allows, or at least we need to think about how to ensure that that IP value comes back to the producer. It's not lost to a global third party, and it's not forgotten when we come to that kind of financing issue.
That's my favorite subject. Don't launch me on that, you know, because it's really, you know, a producer is taking risks to create IP. Is financing another. Is gathering talent. Is taking risks with his own money, or maybe, you know, getting money from a national support system. But is taking risk. Is not paid. Is creating a value, an asset that we cannot leave. It's like we cannot leave to others. Even if someone said, "Oh, I paid for 100% of the fabrication," and you were paid on the fabrication. Okay, I was paid on the fabrication, but I didn't get any remuneration on the asset we created, and we need to keep that asset. This is super important. We need, all of us in Europe need to keep that asset. Need to keep a fair remuneration that is possible for performers, for others, for music, the music industry, but not for producers. It's insane. You know, it's a situation that should not exist.
Okay, that's a good favourite subject. More of a football fan myself, but I do understand where you're coming from. Mattias, you are as an organisation, as a company, you've been around, I think it's fair to say, for quite a few years. TRIART, I think, is already looking at how you navigate and create value through digital platforms alongside the very complex and difficult Swedish model. But just give us a view of where you think we stand right now and how that can be improved.
You hear me? Yeah, I even hear myself. Well, the thing is, I'm also a producer.
Of course.
You know, I produce it quite a lot. And so I see, I think I've been aware of some major problems, and that is what happened from 2018, 19 up to now is that we are overproducing. The overproduction is also, I mean, there is a tremendous competition about getting teams, getting not only money and distribution, etc., but it's also huge competition about teams. So when the explosion of the TV series production came in 2020, and I'm a producer not for TRIART film. It's called the Be Real Films. We totally changed the whole strategy and went into, I would say, we are 7 producers. I'm the only one from 2020 who's producing features. So everyone went into TV series. And why? Because it's easy. Easy in a way of financing. I mean, they're originals. So we go to the public service television, and they come up with 60-70% of the financing, etc. And it's less risky. So, and that was the owner's wish. I continue to make my risky features and so forth. But what I also noticed was that the level of quality, or the level of the ambition of keeping up the quality became less. Because, I mean, you have half of the shooting period, you have less budget compared to a feature film if you're talking about the length. You don't get the DOP you wanted to have, you get the third choice, etc., etc. And that was the kind of circle that we got into. And the feature films productions were getting into the same direction, which actually meant that we were, at the end of the day, we were sitting with okay films, okay TV series. Of course, I mean, they filled up a wish in 2020, 2021, because the cinemas more or less were closed. But now I think that they are in a kind of shock, many of the TV series producers at the streaming services. And like the woman here before said, I mean, now we are getting into other type of discussions regarding financing. Because you can't keep up doing what you did in 2020, 2021, which you will also do this year, because that was the result of that period. So I'm a little bit, I'm not worried, but I think there will be big changes. There will be big changes, and there will be less TV series productions and as a whole. And I think there will be more features, because they're more traditional. And you also, of course, I mean, it's a way of what's happening with the cinemas. I mean, we lost in Sweden 25-30%. We had less 25-30% audience in May this year compared to 2019, although, I mean, there were no pandemic anymore. It's getting up a little bit, bit for bit, and I think, I'm positive, because I'm a big fan of the old-fashioned, window school, where you have the, I mean, you can close the whole backs and you can discuss all that, but I'm a big fan of start with the theatrical distribution.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you're making that link, which is a really essential one, between the current situation, the position we're now in terms of cinemas, in terms of the money in the market, in terms of finance and quality. And I think sometimes we're forgetting that the impact long run means there's going to be less quality work, and maybe more less quality over work is your argument. I don't know whether that's shared by Alexandra, but you have, the cinema thing is really interesting. We're here to talk about VOD, but you have built a VOD service.
Yeah.
And at the moment, how does that balance work? I mean, is that something which is the growing part of the business, and are we at a stage at this moment where VOD and cinema can find something where you have the same levels of finance, you have something which is sustainable and viable going forward?
Yeah, I mean, as a distributor, because it's a distribution company that owns the VOD service, and of course, I mean, it was it's getting more and more important, because if you go back in 2018 or before that, I mean, it was more kind of interesting cultural thing, you know. Now it's commercial. Now it's important. But I refuse to say it's going to take over the cinema part, because I think the cinemas, I mean, if we're going to keep up the high quality level of the features or the whatever we are talking about, the moving pictures, we need the cinemas. So I don't think it should be any kind of, you know, competition between those. But of course, I mean, it's as a kind of complement, and a very, very important complement, which was proven, you know, during the pandemic years. I mean, we're putting a lot of resources into the VOD service. It's also very, you could say, I mean, our VOD, which is quite big, it's high quality. I mean, we're talking about art house films.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't do you know, medium mainstream films there. Yeah.
No,
that's our profile. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come to the platforms in a second, but actually, what we're talking about here, both of you are pointing to a position of potential, but actually some of it being lost somewhere. And when you talk about cinema and VOD, it's more, there's an ecosystem that we all talk about, but that ecosystem still feels to me like it's something which is emerging rather than necessarily exists right now.
Yeah, because we don't really know. I mean, everyone are guessing. You know, I mean, the decrease of HBO Nordic, for instance. I mean, no one could even imagine. Which happened right now, you know, and what's happening out there, we're just guessing, and we're talking about holdback periods, for instance, and should it be 1 month or should it be 2 months or whatever? You know, in France they have their own direction. In Sweden we have 4 months, which is quite long, I think, because I think it should be individual for each film. But I mean, those discussions, we don't know. We guess and we try and we experiment, you know. And I think that's what gives people, you know, a kind of messy way of, I mean, how it's going to work in the future, and who is going to be there. Should everything? I mean, I know serious people who think everything should be released at the same day. Everything, you know, free TV. Streaming services, everything.
Okay, we'll come to this, but messy is a great word. And before I come to Vradi, you wanted to make a point, Alexandra, and I'll come back to you, Mattias, on that.
Yes, I think what is, if we look at a macroeconomical point of view, what we have witnesses is a change in the value chain, in the value chain, meaning that the window of the SVOD has taken all the value. That's why we are speaking about, you know, the value of the IP in the SVOD-based market rather than in a theatrical market. And we have seen not only the audience decreasing, but the number of film and the blockbusters decreasing, and that they are the ones that are bringing the audience to the European film. So it's the baddest news we can have for the future of the theatrical distribution and the high quality of feature film, because they were the one bringing a lot of audience more easily into theaters. Getting back to, I think, what said Wendy, we have seen some experiments of Netflix with Stranger Things being released in theaters in the UK, and I was trying to have figures about that, you know, how did it go, and I couldn't have any comments on that, which means that is super confidential and is super important. So I do believe that the SVOD platform will move into theaters very soon, and will use that to increase again the value on the SVOD window. And they will do it with shows that are with a very high quality. I have 3 kids, 9, 13, and 19. They all told me, Mom, you need absolutely to look Stranger Things to watch it. It's very, very good, fantastic. And I didn't want to because it's not, you know, the kind of show I used to watch. And I did, and I was astonished by the quality. And I cannot imagine my kids now watching a Marvel after watching a show of that quality, you know. It's a new narrative, it's a new way. It's really something that is not only disturbing the value chain, but also the quality of the films. And I can feel that the studio, the US studio, are far beyond, you know, far away.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. Actually, data is also one that's worth throwing in at this point. Is if we're in a mess, and it's a messy world, and we are trying to find ways to navigate it, not having data and not having the knowledge is quite difficult. And because anyone can interpret success or failure by whatever way they want, and they all do. We come to variety, because I think we're trying to find at the end of this ways that the things that might make a difference. But you know, I think you've had ideas here when you listen to those first two about how that ecosystem might work.
Yeah, no, first I want to build on what Alexandra said, and that is actually the importance of IP and retaining IP as producer, and especially for European film. So on the one hand, we have this trend right now, which actually the global platforms are coming into Europe or around the world, and they're producing more local production. So on the short term, it's great because, you know, they're creating more local production, creating jobs, etc. But actually, we need to look beyond that. We need to look beyond about, you know, the livelihoods, the long term, the legacy. What are we losing here? And actually, what we're losing is a lot. It's the heart of the European story. It's the heart of the European voice. It's our independence, our autonomy, our authenticity, and most of all, the long-term sustainability and our ability to reinvest and innovate as an industry. Because what happens essentially a lot with these global platforms is they're hiring producers or they're hiring directors for projects, for series, but they're essentially gun for hires. So basically you hire them in, you do a project or maybe a few-shot project, but these producers or production company don't really get to see the longer-term benefits, how the film is doing. They can't see the long tail of the economic viability. So I think it's very important that, first of all, we need to understand how we as an industry, VOD platforms and producers, can work together a lot closer. So there is a role for European VOD platforms to become more involved in production. That's something I think many people in the Eurovod ourselves are very passionate about. And the value that we can bring is exactly, as Michael touched on earlier, is data. Stranger Things worked because Netflix did a survey and they saw that people were interested in 1980s nostalgia, right? There's a lot of people of this generation getting older and really missing the 1980s. So having this kind of data, knowing what to produce, what genre people are interested in, will prevent us making lower quality films or TV series to start off with. So VOD platforms working with producers where in the new model where these producers can go on to enjoy IP rights where they can continue to have long-term profitability will help the European film industry, producers and VOD platform to continue to grow on their profit and to reinvest, and especially for new talent as well. And I think that's why we need to look beyond this short term and really do something, because a lot in the heart of this industry is at stake.
We'll discuss that obviously in producers' relationships with platforms, and I understand that, but it's also about building scale, isn't it? I mean, for a producer, a lot of the services that are niche have enormous value, of course, but niche are small, and how you pull them together and to create cooperation and collaboration that makes it interesting, I think, is an issue. I mean, it's the contrast between the giants who can give you money right now and a really small player in terms of revenues is obviously problematic. So how do you go about building that kind of scale and relationship with producers that would be attractive to producers? Maybe Marc, you could join that as well.
Yeah, because we talked about niches, and I'm very, very grateful for what Guy forecasted, that we are somewhere in this middle growth range of what's going to be next. As an LGBT media company focused on that particular audience, working across Europe, scale is extremely important, because of course we cannot put a kind of budget like a traditional player can put on the table to get originals being done. But what we try to do is, for this particular niche, there's a lot of content being produced, but mostly not even exploited at all. And what we think is what we would helpful, and we discussed it this morning also with the commission, as I told earlier, that we see that there's a lot of potential for what we say the library content or content, which is a kind of secondary or third window, which is currently not being exploited at all. That if the thresholds to get that kind of content being digitalized and being exploited would definitely create additional revenue streams for the producers, of course, in the long run as well, but also to meet more audience and to find new people who have not been in contact with that. So next to the fact that, of course, scale is important to create new original productions, it's also important to look from our perspective to serve audiences which have not been addressed before when you have economies of scale, and also to address them and to localize the content for this audience. And therefore, I would love to hear from Alexandra as well, how she feels about the idea we submitted this morning to work more on a kind of equal exploitation model like revenue shares than just asking all the time new NGs for content which is already there on the shelf for a while, when these models can at least reduce for partners like us the options to find new audiences and find also new revenues over time.
Did you know that? Were you aware of that kind of model, and does that, from a production point of view, does that work?
As a producer, I've worked with all kinds of models, together with Netflix, with Seymour, who's a Scandinavian Nordic player, and Viaplay, which was mentioned before. I've done all kinds of models, actually, we have done a second window, we have done premium window, we have done originals. I mean, all of them. The problem is that the attitude from not only from the streaming services, from the other finances as well, is the rules, so to say, is changing all the time, and that is, I mean, what we were talking about when I described it as a kind of messy situation. It was more that we don't, as a producer, and also in the next step as a distributor, we don't get the time to reflect and evaluate and see how did that system work. I think, for instance, I had a great journey with as a producer with Netflix on a Swedish film where they came in and just bought the SVOD rights, you know, as anyone, so to say, you know. And then they are, of course, after the free TV, etc. You know, and so there are so many models, and some of them are working very well for one type of film, and others are working for another way for another type of film. When it comes to our VOD service, I mean, what we try to do, I mean, for TRIART, is that we try to be very, very close to every producer in Sweden. So we get more or less everything that's not super big mainstream. I mean, we have The Boy from Heaven, we have the Holy Spider, and all those quite famous films, you know, from Cannes and so forth. We have them. And of course, what we try then to do is, when we get into the platform, we try to evaluate, could we do it exclusively, or do we need the other ones? Because, I mean, we're not only talking about SVOD, we're also talking about TVOD. And in our service, we have both TVOD and SVOD. It's up to the consumer. And we also have a magazine you can have, you know, put in, film magazine. So it's always a kind of valuation, and the valuation is done between the producer and the distributor, and hopefully in the best way, you know. I mean, so everyone can gain. But this is another kind of, I mean, what I talked about before was the competition to where it becomes risky for keeping up the high quality level.
Mattias, I mean, the interesting thing with you is you actually are, you see the production side, the distribution side, and the VOD side. Part of the problem, I think, that Verada was alluded to is that we're all having conversations in the film industry which, Europa Cinemas members will be having a discussion in a crisis about how to protect cinemas. There'll be a bit of discussion about how distributors can protect their interests and producers, but it feels like the conversation that would be useful would be one that actually can take a more holistic view and look at what would be effective. But that's not one we're having. And somehow in the mess and the non-conversation, it feels like a lot of value is getting lost.
I think we need the time to test models. I think that's one of the. It was so hectic during these 2-3 years, in one direction here, and when you tested that, and then all of a sudden the cinemas opened, and then they closed, and then they opened, and we talked about holdbacks. We talked about who is going to be first out there. I mean, we didn't have the time, and now we have the time, should have the time, I think we must have the time, because we need to evaluate, I mean, what kind of models are usable?
Yeah.
I mean, where everyone gain, and I mean, talking about cinema, for instance, I don't think anyone loses on, I mean, if you have a high quality film, I mean, if you have Ruben Östlund, of course it's good for any, for any VOD service, or free TV, or whatever you talk about, the windows after the cinema. Of course, it's good for everyone to have it released in theatrically. I mean, it's good for the free TV. It's good for whoever is doing the SVOD, etc.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's hard to have a conversation about the future when you're worried about how you're going to pay your electricity bill, and it becomes that kind of. That's perhaps some of the issue. I just want to quickly go back to the point. What would be useful, actually, if you could pitch that model to one of Alexandre's members, what would the pitch be? Just quickly pitch to Alexandra, and then she can give you the reaction again. The top line pitch of what you see as a model.
It is actually not so complicated. As VOD operators, we of course looking into enriching our databases, and Guy mentioned it this morning. The larger your database is, actually it's more likely that your subscribers will stay, or you find new advertised-based viewers. Perhaps that's the next thing to do. For our perspective, it's important. I think it's also for Mattias, when he looks into his VOD operation, the upfront costs to get content make available and to be able to publish. Of course, you have to get the rights cleared. And often what we see with a traditional model, and the way how we work, sales agents, of course, always want to have some upfront money, no matter what. But actually, for this third window of exportation, they're not so much interested in that, because they first have the windows of opportunity for every festival to sell that kind of new, latest content first. But after the second or the third or the fourth festival, that kind of title is no longer interesting. And I think for us it would be still interesting to have that kind of stories on our platforms, because there might still be an audience for that. But of course we have to invest also in making that title available, not just by the technical facilitation and the marketing, to finally find audience to bring that story to them. And that would be what would make our lives much more easier, if then the discussions with the right holders, which are represented by sales agents offer, can be more reluctant to easier to work with them, if there's a kind of commitment, let me put it like that, to do this kind of deals on a kind of rev share basis only. So it makes it for us easier, and the investment from our side is at least better to understand before we move into a publication and publicate those titles we're currently not being used and just are on the shelf.
Okay, so I think if you were putting that down to a single sentence, there's lost value there for you, but it probably requires a different kind of level of flexibility on with the platforms. Is that something you've thought about or makes sense?
We always are super happy to sell our films as long as we have the rights. It's a key. Do we have the rights when you need it? I'm not sure, because sometimes it's a distributor or the sales agent with us having the rights. But we are always super happy to give value to our films, and I can tell you that it's a question about the value of the catalog. How do we value the catalog? How do we spread our content on the SVOD platform? Is something that we're having as a discussion at the European Producers Club, and it's going to be more and more. But the value you get, the revenues you get are very low. So you need to compensate the cost of it. As you mentioned, many of our members have tried the near TOD model on Amazon. You know, you put your films available and you are paid in minutes, by minutes used by the consumer. And so it's money, it's not that complicated. You need to have the subtitle, you need to have the correct format, but then it's a little bit of money, 20,000, 40,000, which is good in times of crisis to pay the bill. But moreover, our producers are super open into exploring new business models that involved at the beginning local streamers, and that's already the case in certain countries. Viaplay is an example. In the Nordic, they are super present and they are investing a lot. Mubi has started to put AMG, Orange in France as well, and I have another one, Universiné, tried by the past. I don't know where they stand now, but having this, you know, to associate in the production of the films or TV series, this, you know, end user players of the film is something that we can do easily. We usually, if we look at the film industry, go through a distributor. There was a distributor who was doing that case, and in the 50s was going to theaters and say, how much do you give me if I give you the exclusivity of the film? So that's what their role. I'm not sure that they are targeting that today, and that's something that we can also explore as a distributor, but we need an entity, a financial entity that takes the risks that you are asking. It can be equity, it can be, but we need to be imaginative, and we are trying to be, and to involve you at the beginning.
So we're still at that stage of experimentation. You're open, but right now there's lots of things that are there to explore, and I think that's probably a positive kind of message. Look, what I've got from this panel is that everyone, it's not that complicated. We want high quality films that are from diverse producers that are able to keep hold of their own IP and to exploit it in ways that may now be opening up. And we want it to connect with audiences in ways that audiences actually work. It's just, it feels like it's so simple, but right now, each bit of that feels like we're trying to have the old, we're trying to impose a new model on an old model. I mean, it's as people used to say about the combustion engine, you'd never invent it now, but people with cars, you know, are we at the electric car stage now? And I just wanted one thing to finish. Just what's the one thing that we need to be doing to get back to a model? Do we need to rip things up, or do we need just a different conversation? Mattias? Time. Yeah.
No, but we're sitting here 6 months after the whole Europe or the whole world were closed for 2 years. I mean, it was a mess. I mean, the society was a mess. The world was a mess. And 6 months afterwards, we think we should have know everything about, because everything changed during these years. Naturally, because, you know, I mean, it was really, really tough to produce during these years, to shoot. I mean, I tried to get in to shoot in Holland for 5 months, and it was closed. I tried to get into Greece to shoot, and it was closed for 8 months. I mean, everything was a mess in a way. And of course, the streaming services saw that they had a huge and good opportunity to take the space. And now, I mean, in March, everything changed back to normal in a way. And now we think 6 months afterwards that we should have all the answers of how the new model should look like. I think it's time. I think we need to evaluate. I think we need to calm down a little bit. I think we need to sit down and talk, you know, about what are the possibilities, what are the different kind of business models, and I think also that we can really, really get to collaborate in a good way. If we just have the good films.
Okay.
Whatever we're talking about, art house films or mainstream films, it doesn't matter. I think they have to be high up there. And if we have the good films, then we can talk concretely, you know, with everyone.
Okay. So I mean, looking at the future when your house is on fire, that's kind of where we've been. But we need the fire to be put out before we can kind of look forward, and we're at that kind of stage. It made a lot of sense to me. So just really, this is a one line, and then we're kind of finishing. So Alexandra.
I think I don't want to promote what we are doing, but sharing experiences for me is key because many producers, they are pragmatic and they need to live and they are testing a lot of models. And what is important is that to see the information flowing between the members in order to create that level playing field that the industry is needing.
So yeah, I mean, it's a really good message actually, and it's one that I think everyone should take away, which is no one's closed-minded about anything. Yeah. The options are there, but we need to assess and evaluate on the basis of realities. So, Virada?
I think for me, I think we also hinted at this, was actually a closer cooperation between the producers and VOD platform at an earlier stage. Already at the development, understanding the data, understanding what audience actually wants to see, what works in some country, what doesn't work in some country. I think, some practical ideas could be running, a series of workshop idea labs. Maybe you don't have to start with the biggest budget film, maybe just even a few $100,000s or independent VOD platform. A couple of us can already jump in together. We can start, for example, with LGBT, a genre that we know sells straight away and could recoup the money. But I think starting with practical steps where we have leading producers association or production companies like yourself, independent VOD platform coming together, working on a few film, smaller budget to start off with, have the learnings from there, and then have a big PR and publicity around this kind of project. I think let's start getting out there and doing things.
Let's talk. That's a good. And again, Marc, you can have the final word.
Yeah, I see it is already a bit after 1, so I think it's time to close this discussion and this conference for today. I really would like to thank you all for coming, because also for us it was a short period of time to prepare this conference for today. I would like to thank everyone to be here. I think it was good to have the discussions we had. I really was grateful for all the speakers today to talk and to give reference and guidance to everything what is going on in our markets. What I like about being here, we might need a bit of time, but what I like about it, and it gets me energized, that so much is happening that gives us at least a lot of perspectives and new things to look forward to. And I love to be with you next year, that we can evaluate another exciting year, what's coming, what will be in front of us. So thank you so much. Love to see you next year. And again, thank you for coming today. Thank you. And most of all, thank you, Mike.